everyone. So yeah, like Mel said, I kind of took a bit of a lead in our latest exhibition, Kilvert's World. This story, this tale of the Wiltshire Heiress, really captured Kilvert's imagination over the winter of 1873 and 1874. He dedicated 2 or 3 diary entries, quite lengthy ones, to retelling the story. And he even visited Draycot House on the 15th of December 1873 to take a tour of the rooms, and so he was really interested in it. Now, the Wiltshire Heiress story happens largely between 1811 and 1830. Now, Kilvert wasn't born until 1840, so what he writes in his diary are largely the recollections of 2 local women called Mrs. Knight and Mrs. Banks. And what this sort of tells us is that Kilvert loved a bit of gossip and he loved a bit of scandal, and this in the story is a perfect example, and how much time he spends dedicating to it in his diary is really interesting, especially for a reverend. And yeah, so we really wanted to put it in the exhibition, but we didn't really have the space to do it justice, so here we are today. So the tale of the Wiltshire Heiress is one of vast riches and ruin. There's some adultery, and then there's even a murder plot thrown in as well, so it's got this quite everything. Yeah, so who was the Wiltshire Heiress? She was Catherine Tylney-Long, and she was known as the richest commoner in England when she inherited her estate. And by that we mean she was the richest untitled heiress in the country at the time. Now, she was the daughter of Sir James Long, the 7th Baronet of Draycot, and Sir Lady Catherine Sidney Windsor. Now, the Long family had amassed their fortune over several generations previously. They had estates in Wiltshire, they had Draycot and Seagreen. They held Athelhampton Estate in Dorset. They also had lands in Yorkshire, as well as quite a lot of shares in the East India Company at the time. So they were a wealthy family in their own right. But in addition to this, Catherine's grandfather, Sir Robert Long, also married really, really well. So he married Lady Emma Child. She was, the Child family also were very wealthy. They had Wanstead Hall and the estate in Essex, and they also had Tilney Hall in Hampshire. So unfortunately, Sir John Child, Emma's brother, dies without a wife or children, and so everything from their family passes to Catherine's father and ultimately to her, so that it all joins together to make just a massive inheritance, really. So after Sir James Long dies, his son is supposed to inherit, but unfortunately he dies in 1805 at the age of 11, so before he can come of age and inherit the estate. So Catherine, as the eldest daughter, inherits the entire fortune, which amounted to over 22,500 acres of land, £300,000 worth of shares in the East India Company, and income of over 40,000 a year from all of her various holdings and interests as well. So you can understand why, when she came of age, she was the richest commoner in England. However, it's worth noting at this point that the wills of Sir James Long, her father, and Sir John Child, her great uncle, left really strict rules over what could be done with the vast estate. They were held in trust, they were run by trustees, and there were restrictions over how they could be mortgaged, how they could be divided up, what you could do with the land and everything. So it's worth bearing that in mind for what happens next. So Catherine finally inherits in 1811. When she comes of age, she turns 21. And Kilvert recalls Mrs. Knight and Mrs. Banks' reminiscence of the celebrations in his diary at the start of his entry. He says, "When Miss Long became heiress of Draycot and Wanstead and came of age, there were great rejoicings. An ox was roasted whole in the park, and a troop of yeomanry cavalry guarded it, riding round the roasted ox to keep the people off. When the ox was cut down, half of it was burnt and charred, and the other half was raw. Thousands of people gathered from far and near to see the rejoicing. There was a ball in the great barn too, and horse racing in the park with all sorts of games and fireworks in the evening. So this is Draycot at the time when the celebrations were taking place. And it's kind of amusing and shows like how Kilvert was a bit of a wordsmith. The inclusion of the charred and raw ox is kind of a bit of an omen to what comes later in the story. So with her vast wealth, Catherine becomes a celebrity overnight, and her life and inevitably her courtship are regularly featured in society pages at the time. The Married Women's Property Act wasn't passed until 1882, so this was long after Catherine's death. And that act was the thing that gave women rights over what they brought into a marriage for the first time. So this didn't apply to Catherine, so whoever was going to marry her was in for a huge windfall, as you can tell. So during 1811, after she comes of age, a number of satires were produced. These belong to the British Museum now. This one, called Worshippers at Wanstead, shows Catherine, a golden Catherine, surrounded by her riches and her numerous suitors at the time. So over here we have Lord Kilworth and William Wellesley Pole, and it's even said that they fought a duel over some newspaper verses about Catherine at the time, although no one was hurt. Over here we've got the Duke of Clarence. He was another of Catherine's suitors. And then the others, I don't think they ever proposed to Catherine. They're just sort of eccentric bachelors in the public eye at the time, which their inclusion just sort of shows how much of a celebrity she was at the time. So the second one here shows the leading suitors, both of whom were just after her money. They were notoriously in debt, so it wasn't strange that they were after her. So, as I mentioned, William Wellesley Pole, he was the nephew of the Duke of Wellington at the time, and he was your typical George and Rake in every way. And the Duke of Clarence was the other suitor, and he proposed to Catherine several times, but she continually rejected him, and it's unfortunate for her really because he later becomes King William IV. So she had a chance of becoming queen, but passed it up at the time, and they think that she did because of his long-standing mistress, Miss Jordan, who had several, I think he had about 10 children with her ultimately, and so she wasn't too keen on sort of being second fiddle to Miss Jordan, I don't think. Which again is kind of unfortunate for her, given what ultimately happens in her tale. So obviously William Wellesley Pole is the favourite, and Kilvert's diary entry continues with some of the scandalous details of their courtship. Then came the courtship and marriage of Miss Long, the great heiress, with the scamp Wellesley. Lady Catherine set her face against the marriage, but her daughter was weak and obstinate. The servants were bribed, and the courtship was carried on clandestinely. Wellesley used to drive his tilbury down to the Langley brewery, leave it there, and come and hide himself in the sunk fence in front of this house, what is now Langley Rectory, which is where Kilvert lived. When he had watched Lady Catherine drive across the common into Chippenham with her 4 or 6 long-tailed black horses, leaving Miss Long, the heiress, locked up at home, he would run down to the brewery, get into his tilbury and gallop over to Draycot, where he saw Miss Long by the connivance of the servants. She was infatuated and would not listen to those friends who told her that he was a villain and only wanted her money. So ultimately, even though she did also reject his proposal 6 times, he won out, and she consented to marry him in November of 1811. So before they get married, William decides to change his name by royal decree in January of 1812, and he becomes William Pole Tylney-Long Wellesley, which is a nice mouthful. And then the couple were married at St James's Church in Piccadilly on the 14th of March 1812. And given their celebrity status, naturally it was covered in papers at the time. It was an incredibly lavish and expensive ceremony. The bride wore a robe of real Brussels point lace over white satin and a bonnet of the same material, complete with 2 ostrich feathers. So Catherine's dress cost 700 guineas, her bonnet costed an additional 150 guineas, and her veil another 200 guineas. She also wore a necklace and earrings that were thought to cost £25,000 at the time. And William was into his fashion, so similarly lavishly dressed. They also had solid silver favours made for just 800 of their closest friends and family. Each of them cost a guinea and a half. So yeah, really expensive wedding. As a footnote to the wedding, rather amusingly, Kilvert adds in a reminiscence from local man Isaac Giles, who said that as he left church with his bride, Wellesley, after the wedding, he was tapped on the shoulder for £20,000. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sort of shows his reputation as a bit of a spendthrift. So the marriage settlement, as with any sort of Georgian gentry family, gave William a life interest in Wanstead Hall and the Wanstead estate in Essex, and Tylney-Long and the estate in Hampshire. So that amounted at the time to over half of Catherine's estate. So it was a really generous marriage settlement. But the land in Wiltshire, so Draycot and Seagrave, the land in Dorset and Yorkshire were all left out of the marriage settlement and held in trust for the eldest son when he comes of age, or their future children when they come of age. So they spent the first few years of their marriage living here at Wanstead House, and they had 3 children, William, James and Victoria. So William spent a lot of money redecorating and re-landscaping the whole of Wanstead House and its grounds. It said he was maybe giving the Prince Regent a run for his money with the amount of money and gold and red and lavish interior he was adding. They were also known for holding lavish parties here. Again, they entertained royalty and foreign sovereigns, and parties would go on until 8 o'clock in the morning. William was known for having a box at the Opera and Drury Lane Theatre, where he would regularly entertain the entire cast at his own expense. And he was also really into his fashion, he was really into horses and hounds as well, so he spent an awful lot of money very quickly, living the high life. He also spent a hell of a lot of money on his election campaigns. So previously to meeting Catherine, he was MP for St Ives. That was a seat that he just bought with his wealth. And he becomes MP for Wiltshire in 1818. And there was the reason he was so keen on becoming and staying an MP was 2 reasons really. What I was saying before about her father and her great uncle's wills restricting what could be done with the Long estate. You needed acts of Parliament to get certain things, and so being an MP obviously gave him sway over what happened to more of Catherine's estate. And MPs at the time were also, you couldn't prosecute them for debt, so as long as he was an MP, he couldn't be put in debtor's prison. So Kilvert also recalled in his diary entry about William's election campaign to become MP for Wiltshire. Isaac Giles says he remembers hearing Long Wellesley make an election speech from the Angel, which is just next door, in the course of which he told people how he had got up the old lady's legs and married her daughter. So, just shows how pleased he was with his conquest and with his newfound wealth, and he wasn't really afraid of boasting about it to people, even when he's trying to be returned as an MP. Following on from these early years of vast spending, it quickly became apparent that Catherine should have heeded the warnings of her mother and her friends before marrying William. In 1817, just 5 years into their marriage, William is spending so far beyond his means that he uses his position as an MP to get an Act of Parliament overriding Catherine's father's will and allowing him to sell the Athelhampton estate in Dorset and the land in Yorkshire to raise funds. In 1820, after the death of King George III, he loses his seat as an MP and with it his immunity from prosecution for debt. In 1821, unfortunately for Catherine, her first account of an affair comes to light. It's with a lady called Maria Kinnaird, and to keep it quiet and to keep her away, Catherine knew about it and she paid the lady £600 a year to live more than 50 miles away from her and William. By 1821, William's creditors weren't paying. And as I said before, because of the wills and the marriage settlement, although he still managed to get hold of the lands that he wasn't supposed to, there wasn't enough cash, and he had really restricted options on what else he could do. They couldn't remortgage and they couldn't sell or divide up any of his estates that he'd inherited. So instead, he decides to sell the entire contents of both Wanstead House and Tylney-Hall. So everything that the Long family and the Child families had amassed and collected over the years, all of their family furniture and belongings, William sold for money. So the Wanstead sale took place in June 1822. It took 6 weeks and there were 5,000 lots altogether, making a total of around £41,380. Now, William wasn't the only member of the Georgian gentry that was in debt. It wasn't an uncommon thing. The issue with it was that the public nature of their debt, the public sale of the contents of 2 of their estates in the newspapers and everything, caused huge scandal at the time. So much so that halfway through the Wanstead sale, Catherine, William and their 3 children fled to France, having disgraced their family name completely, trying to avoid their creditors. Unfortunately, the content sale wasn't enough. It didn't raise enough money to satisfy the creditors, and despite the death of Catherine's mother in 1823, William still can't get his hands on the Wiltshire side of the estate. So ultimately he decides to demolish Wanstead House and Tylney-Hall completely, raze them to the ground to sell the building materials to raise a bit of money. Oh, he doesn't stop there. Interestingly, during this time, while William has destroyed half of her estate already, they're fled in France, Catherine is writing letters to her sisters back in London, explaining how happy she is with her husband and their life, and how kind her husband is to her, which is a bit unusual. But she thought she was happy. Then, in mid-1823, Helena Bligh enters the picture and she begins an affair with William in France. Now, she is married to Captain Bligh at the time, who's a guardsman, I believe, recovering from ill health in Italy at the time. Ultimately, Helena decides to leave her husband completely and follows William and Catherine around Europe so that they can continue their affair. Understandably, after a while, after a few months of this, Catherine gets a bit fed up and she takes her children and flees back to England and approaches William's father, Lord Maryborough, for help. In a letter to his son, he writes, "The whole world approves of your wife's separation from you. If you do not separate yourself from this abandoned, profligate wretch, you must share her fate." And despite his family's pleadings, and despite his pleading Catherine to come back to him, William won't give up Mrs. Bligh, and by the end of 1824, she falls pregnant with their son. So Kilvert continues his recollection of the story at this point with something from his mother. My mother remembers the wretched wife not long afterwards coming up to Langley Fitzurse to my grandfather's to borrow money, for the bailiffs were in Draycot house and her scamp of a husband had left her destitute. She was a mean-looking little woman, as weak as water. So in a few years, Catherine's gone from beautiful celebrity to mean-looking, and I think from Kilvert's opinion, as much to blame as her husband for her situation, which is potentially slightly unfair, but maybe reveals sort of Victorian attitudes to women at the time. Despite Kilvert's opinion of her, Catherine does ultimately decide to divorce William, and she begins divorce proceedings in May of 1825. And unusually, she gets to keep her children during this time. Usually they would go back and stay with their father, and it's thought that one of the reasons why she got to keep her children was because she got help from William's father, Lord Marlborough. And this causes him and William to fall out irrevocably at this point. Getting a bit desperate, William sends Catherine numerous threatening letters at the time, demanding custody of his children. He makes several attempts to kidnap his children. He even sneaks over to London and sneaks into her house and berates her for custody of his children at this time. And it all ultimately just gets too much for Catherine, who falls seriously ill in September of 1825. She just about manages to revoke her will, which favoured William at the time, before she sadly died on the 12th of September 1825, and she was aged just 35 at the time. And this is the memorial stone her children gave her, which is in St James's Church in Draycot now. So, still strapped for cash, William was still in trouble, and the best hope now for him was his children, was his eldest son, who was in line to inherit. Catherine's will left her children in the temporary custody of her sisters and her uncle, in the hope that ultimately the Duke of Wellington, William's uncle, would take over guardianship of the children after a court settlement. So the case is going to go to the Chancery Court, but William isn't happy about this at all, and obviously he objects immediately. And the case is dragged out through the Chancery Court throughout 1826. Now it drags out so long because there are loads of affidavits and counter-affidavits filed in the case, both for and against William's moral character and his ability to raise his children. Interestingly, most of the counter-affidavits, those that are against him, come from his own family. So they come from his father and his uncles, who are trying to avoid him getting custody of his children. And in the course of this, loads of sort of salacious details about William and the way he lives his life come out, about his immoral nature, how profligate he is, accounts of him having venereal disease and giving it to Catherine come out as well as accounts that he takes his sons gambling and to cockfights in London and teaches them how to swear as well. So all of this comes out in court against him. And at the same time, he's still with Helena Bligh, who now has the son with him, which continues to reflect badly upon him at the time. In the middle of this case over custody of the children, Captain Bligh also decides to sue William. So that's Helena's husband, decides to sue William for criminal conversation, which is essentially property damages. So because William ran away with his wife, who under common law was his property, he sues William for damages. This causes a complete media frenzy in the middle of their custody case, and William is ordered to pay £6,000 in damages to Captain Bligh, which isn't a small sum, but we don't think he ever paid a penny of it. Finally, judgment comes in February of 1827, And in a landmark ruling, Chancellor Eldon rules against William and doesn't allow him access to his children, or and he's not allowed to raise them. And this is, I think this is the first, or one of the first instances where this happens ever, because usually, as I said before, fathers are allowed to keep custody of their sons. So it's a massive deal at the time, as you can see from it being satirised here, and another print from the British Museum. After this, the tale escalates further and gets even more ludicrous as William gets more desperate. He appeals this judgment in the House of Lords and continues to submit affidavits and petitions to the court. As you can see here, he's surrounded by all of his affidavits and his legal documents that he keeps putting out there. He also begins some more underhanded things. So he starts a public pamphleteering campaign against his family, so against the Wellesleys, who are given custody of the children in lieu of him. So he tries to defame them and show that they are vicious and immoral. He starts putting out stories about the Duke of Wellington being a womanizer at the time, claiming that he was having an inappropriate relationship with a woman and her husband. He also goes after Catherine's sisters, who are taking care of their daughter at the time, saying that they're fanatical Methodists. He claims they hired a prostitute as a teacher for their daughter, and he even says that one of them is having an incestuous relationship with their uncle, which means that they shouldn't be looking after his daughter. He also, alongside putting all of this out in the public, he continues his kidnap attempts. He kidnaps Victoria for a few months and takes her away to Europe. He steals his middle son away and takes him to London and shows him the high life and sort of leads him astray. And he even, so annoyed with his family, he even begins a plot to he starts plotting to kill the Duke of Wellington, who at this point was almost, if not, Prime Minister at the time. So not a great idea, and he doesn't go through with it, but he definitely gets so annoyed that he considers it and he talks to people about it. In 1828, after Captain Bligh divorces her, he marries Helena, which adds additional fodder to the newspaper mill. And between 1830 and 1832, he finally goes to debtor's jail twice, but he doesn't stay there for very long. He's got some mates that pay a bit of money and get him out on bail. And also, in the same time that he's put in prison, he manages to be returned as an MP for Essex and St Ives in absentia. I don't know how he managed that, but I think that bought him a bit of time. So not long after he marries her, in 1833, William separates from Helena Bligh and runs off with their Italian maid. It's thought that he separated from Helena over an argument about jewellery. Presumably he asked to sell hers and she said no. He refuses to divorce her, but he also doesn't support her. So ultimately, sadly for Helena, she has a similarly sad end to Catherine, and she ends up without support in Wanstead Workhouse, where she spends the last years of her life. Finally, for William, in 1834, his son, William, comes of age and finally inherits the Draycot estate in Wiltshire, and is immediately put under pressure from his father to pay his debts, which he does. He remortgages the remaining land and does what he can to pay off more of his father's debts. Although it's worth noting, although he does that, somehow, and I'm not entirely sure how, the Draycot estate does survive. Draycot House survives in the family. So he doesn't destroy everything, just nearly. So it's thought that the Long Welsleys over this period amassed £33 million worth of debt.
Wow.
This is probably an exaggerated figure, but it sort of shows the scale and how quickly he managed to amass that amount of debt. He wasn't married to her for very long. So yeah, it's just a phenomenal amount, really. He did receive some kind of comeuppance, so despite his son helping him and paying some of his debts, William spends his last few years in poverty, in rented rooms in London, and he dies in 1857 at the age of 69. His obituary in the Morning Chronicle was less than kind to him. It read, "A spendthrift, a profligate and a gambler in his youth, he became a debauchee in his manhood, redeemed by no single virtue, adorned by no single grace. His life has gone out, even without flicker of repentance. We have no wish further to illustrate such a theme by writing what should be his epitaph." So, I suppose people knew that he was no good, but it didn't stop him. He was ultimately buried at Kensal Green Cemetery in London, and as a final entry to the diary, as a final note in the diary entry, when Kilvert was talking to Mary, he said, "We were remarking that Long Wellesley was not buried at Draycot." "No," said Mary decidedly, "he wasn't worth carriage." So that's it. I know Catherine kind of got lost at the end of the story, which is unfortunate. But that's the sad tale of the Wiltshire Heiress and her rapid rise to fame and riches, which was quickly extinguished in a matter of years by a poor choice of husband who left her destitute and squandered her estate. And it's all connected to us locally through the land at Draycot, and also through Kilvert's love of gossip and a good tale that he loved to record in his diary. I would just say quickly as well, if you're interested in the story, a lot of it came from local historian Tim Couzens' book Hand of Fate. So if you want to know more about what happened before or after, I would recommend. That's it.